Welcome, everyone. So today, PSEAT and Shape Up will be hosting a lunch and learn with Matthias from the Budget Justice Coalition. So I'll introduce our co-chairs of PSEAT, which includes myself, Blythe Young, she, her pronouns. I work for the American Heart Association as their community advocacy director, and I also have co-chaired PSEAT, Shape Up's Policy Systems Environment Action Team for the past 4 years. And I'm joined by my co-chair, Laura Vollmer. And Laura, do you want to take a quick second and introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce Matthias?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Laura Vollmer. I'm the Community Nutrition and Health Advisor at University of California Cooperative Extension, and definitely very new to PC, but have been really enjoying the work of this action team, including bringing you all this wonderful lunch and learn.
Awesome. So as Marianne put in the chat, we encourage all of our participants to introduce yourselves in the chat, include your pronouns and your organization, and what you're hoping to take away from the training today. But now I will switch to introducing Matthias. So Matthias is the Chief of Staff for Chinatown CDC, or was the Chief of Staff for Chinatown CDC, sorry, too much coffee. Matthias is tasked with creating better internal alignment, streamlining and reducing barriers to decision-making while being focused on follow-through and moving issues to completion. Matthias grew up in Europe and worked on the issue of globalization and how communities across the world can unite to stand up for unfair and oppressive economic policies. Matthias started his career at Chinatown CDC working with SRO families across the city to demand access to city services and more housing opportunities. Ever since starting his nonprofit career in San Francisco, Matthias has been involved in the city budget from an advocacy standpoint to working at City Hall on the budget to being a trainer and former co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition. Matthias holds a BA in Russian literature and culture from the University of Perugia and an MA in ethical finance from the University of Ferrara. And I will pass it over to Matthias. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, sorry, pass it to Laura first.
Yes, thanks, Blythe. So yes, before we jump in, we wanted to offer a land acknowledgement. So we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, and they are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. And we are guests, and we wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the Ramaytush Ohlone and affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. And I think in a moment we'll put a link in the chat so you can look up to see the land that you are on, and feel free to chat that. And with that, thanks, Marianne. Now, I think, Blythe, you might do a little content on PC, and then finally we will hear from Matthias.
Wonderful. It's been a busy week, y'all, but I'm very happy to be here. So Shape Up exists in many forms. We are first and foremost a convener of aligned partners, and we work to advance health equity in San Francisco by collaborating with community on system changes that include nutrition security and active living. So we have our strategies, which are convening, collective impact, learning and networking, stakeholder capacity building to address health equity and upstream risk, and of course PSEAT, which is the Policy Systems and Environmental Strategies portion of our action team. So we have on the right 10 reasons to join Shape Up Coalition. We have quarterly coalition meetings where you get to meet all sorts of folks and learn about each other's work and work on collective action. And then we also have our action teams, which are PSEAT and CBAT, which stands for Capacity Building Action Team. And so both of those are really where the work happens in Shape Up. And then we all come together at the coalition level. And above all that, and a big hug, as Marianne likes to say, we have our steering committee, which sort of surrounds all of the work together. So if you have joined us today and you're not yet part of our coalition, please feel free to check us out and come as often as you would like. And then I think finally, we can pass it to Matthias. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. So my name is Matthias. I'm Chief of Staff at Chinatown CDC, which is a affordable housing and community development organization based here in San Francisco, Chinatown. And I usually start these trainings with kind of two things. One is my own budget story and the reason we are probably here and you're probably interested in this topic, which is so many services, so many things get touched by the San Francisco city budget or your own municipality's budget if you live in another city. Like literally going to an office and seeing somebody there who can help you, or seeing a door that is closed, having access to those services in the language that you are most comfortable in, or knowing that the nonprofit that you work at has sustainable funding for the time to come, are all things that are tied to the budget. The reason I am here today to talk about the budget is actually because the first job I got when I immigrated to the United States was working at a nonprofit with families that live in SROs. And I had been in that job all of 2 weeks in the winter of 2008 when the program was slated for mid-year budget cuts. So all of a sudden I was excited. I had my first job in the United States, and all of a sudden I didn't have it anymore. That program was slated to be cut by 50% and then to be eliminated come June of 2009. And so I didn't know anything about the city budget. I didn't know very little about advocacy at the city level, but I had to learn really quickly. And I think that while kind of the numbers and some of the rhetoric is a little bit scary around kind of how big of a budget deficit we're in, it's not as bad as 2008 and 2009, but it is the first year in a while in which the city is saying we're going to actually take cuts to CBO providers and to CBO organizations. And this is, you know, in the rhetoric of some folks, long overdue. The other thing that I try to bring up is, like, you might think the budget is just, you know, a very large spreadsheet that says this money goes to this place, this employee category is paid this much. And so you're like, I don't know, I do like social justice work, I do food justice work, I do work around, you know, health equity, like, why does it even matter to me? And I think that the thing that I like to remind people of, or remember myself, is like the Reverend Martin Luther King says, budgets are moral documents. It's easy to say that the city is committed to equity. It's easy to say that the city is committed to health. It's easy to say the city is committed to justice, you know, safety, whatever it is that you think the city should really work on. But it is another thing entirely to say the city I live in, the city that I work in, the city that I care about actually puts money into that and actually dedicates appropriate funding to that. It's easy to say that San Francisco is dedicated to building affordable housing. If it doesn't put any money into affordable housing, actually, I don't care that, you know, there's a policy statement that says the city is dedicated to affordable housing. So budgets are moral documents because every year they actually show what the policy priority for the city is. And you can drill down and see, hey, what does it look like? Who is funded? What are the organizations that, you know, receive funding? What are the organizations that don't receive funding? And kind of understand what the city's priorities are. This is particularly important when it comes to years in which the budget is not looking great, because then you really see what the priorities are. Do we need, you know, there are two supplementals, like we're talking about a $200 million budget deficit, yet the Board of Supervisors and the mayor are considering two additional supplemental funding, one for police and the district attorney's office, and the other one for the Department of Public Work. And I'm not going to get into kind of like what is important, what is not important, but I'm just saying, remember that budgets are moral documents, because this is actually the decisions that we're going to be faced on come June, which is, should we fund this or should we fund that? And sometimes certainly that is, you know, politicized and be like, well, I'm just going to pit something that's unpopular against something that's popular in the media. So watch out for the spin. But the reality is that choices have to be made. And so the city makes choices every day, and the city budget that comes out once a year is actually a list and a compilation of those choices. I'm going to kick us off with some big numbers, and I'm going to start share screen so you can follow along with my presentation. There we go. Okay, let me know if you see my screen and see my slides. Everything good?
We can see
We
it.
see your working slides.
Oh,
Yeah.
you see my working slide. How about now?
Perfect.
Perfect. All right. Okay. So the two things we're going to talk about today after my conversations with Marianne was like, what is the city budget, why it matters, and we've started with that. And then how can you influence the city budget? We're going to start with the big numbers. What matters, and kind of like, what are the things to remember? San Francisco has a budget that this year is going to be almost $14 billion. That seems like a lot of money, and that is a lot of money for a city that's roughly under 800,000 people. A budget of 14 million. Just for comparison's sake, if you look up the budget of the city of Philadelphia, which is double the size of San Francisco, its budget is 6.1 billion. So you see that San Francisco's budget is huge. And so one of the things that I say in these trainings often is, if there's one thing that you leave today with, is I hope you know that when people say that there isn't enough funding for the priority that you're fighting for, don't believe them. $14 billion is a whole lot of money. And it is really, really important that we fight and we, have a say on how that money is spent. Now, I think it's important to remember that of this 14 billion, about half of that is dedicated to the general fund. Now, you're going to hear some lingo. We can send out kind of a budget vocabulary later with the recording of the meeting. But the general fund generally means that it's your tax dollars at work. When you see the big signs that says your tax dollar at work, this is kind of what this label means. These are funds that come from general taxes, sales tax, and other property tax, and other ways in which the city brings in revenue. And it's important to kind of distinguish them as a general fund, because that means those are dollars that can be used for any means necessary. I often give the example that, yes, the city of San Francisco's budget is huge compared to the city of Philadelphia, but it also does some pretty interesting things. The San Francisco budget includes the budget for the San Francisco International Airport. The airport is a city department in San Francisco. That is usually not the case in many jurisdictions. The city runs a port, even though the Port of San Francisco might not be the busiest port that you've ever seen. It does have a functioning port that is part of a city department. So 6.5 billion, or a little over 6.5 billion, are monies that we can allocate to any policy priority that we want in San Francisco, except for the fact that, as you well know, there are taxes and set-asides that are approved by voters in San Francisco, many of them. And those set aside about $1.6 billion in revenues every year. And kind of to give you a sense, about the soda tax, we talked about it, probably about many other taxes, like the Library Preservation Fund, like the Children's Fund, or the Dignity Fund. There are many kind of set-asides and campaigns that you might have heard about. But the reality is that San Francisco is really an outlier when it comes to kind of these funds. It's interesting if you think about it. San Francisco has 19 different set-asides. This is compared to our neighbors to the south, San Jose, who has 2, the city of Oakland, who only has 1 set aside, and the city of San Diego, who has 0, right? So we have 19 of these set asides, and other cities have very few. So without having to do a ton of math, and if you're a visual person like me, I'm going to show you what that kind of looks when it comes to kind of a pie chart. So you have 50% of the budget that goes to enterprise apartments. So these are departments that don't actually, that generate their own revenue. So we talked about the airport. When you buy a coffee at Starbucks or at a local roaster at the San Francisco International Airport, the sales tax that is generated there goes back to funding the airport, the staffing that is needed there, some of the services that are needed there. And so same with your favorite airline, when it lands, it pays a landing fee, and that landing fee stays with the airport. So we can't take money out of the airport to put it to homeless services. We can't take money out of the Public Utilities Commission, or like some folks that are around my age like to call it the water department, and put them into homeless services. All of those departments are enterprise departments, and they generate their own revenue. And that sometimes is a great thing in terms of stability. The airport's pretty stable. Their budget goes a little bit up and down, but is pretty, has been doing pretty well. But you can imagine that a department like the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Authority, the SFMTA, actually struggles quite a lot with the reduced number of people that take the bus, so take public transit, when they have to basically generate their own revenue. So 14 billion, half of it goes to enterprise departments. And then we said about 14% goes to set asides: soda tax, children's fund, dignity fund, our city, our home. 14% of the budget goes to those. So what we're really left with is, a slice of about a third of this budget, about 5 billion out of the 14, that are actually allocated to many priorities across the city. And so I think that what's interesting is to think about then the impact of certain budget priorities on this $5 billion. For example, as outlined in this, if you look at the funding for the San Francisco Police Department, it's about 5% of San Francisco's budget. It's not kind of out of line of other jurisdiction or other cities. But if you think about it in terms of how much of that money is actually part of the money that we can reallocate, it's almost 20%. So 19% of the money that we can allocate to any priority in San Francisco is currently going to the San Francisco Police Department. So I think it's important to understand kind of, when you think about a $14 billion budget, that's cool and interesting and all, but there's only 5 billion of that actually can go to the priorities that we care about, which might be public safety, but that might have a big impact as well when it comes to what the portion of the pie that we're talking about actually means. The budget process, most people get interested in the budget process come June. This is when you read the article in the Chronicle about the mayor presenting her budget. And you first hear about kind of budget priorities, but actually the budget is a document and a process that happens year-round. And it happens year-round, and has many ways in which we can influence the city budget. In 2023, I'm going to give you some highlights about what happens. In December, the mayor releases budget instructions. So in December of 2022, the mayor said, we're in a bad budget year. There's a $200 million budget deficit projected this year and a $700 million budget deficit projected next year. So we got to be aggressive. And so the budget instructions were to cut city programs and city departments by 5 to 10% this year, to compare with, as I said, bad budget years of 2008 and 2009. The requests there were to cut about 20% of each department's budget. Now, of course, departments can choose to do that in many different ways. If you're, I don't know, the Department of Homelessness, you can cut staff. You can cut expenses. You can cut grants for services. So you can, reach those goals that have to do with the budget in many different ways, and each one of them actually takes a slightly different road. In January and February, you have the opportunity to speak to the commission, if there is a commission over your department, but thanks to the work the Budget Justice Coalition has done, even if the department doesn't have a commission, say you really care about what the Department of, well, what's a good one? What the my usual go-to example was Department of Homelessness, but they just got a commission. But let's say that you really care about what the Mayor's Office on Housing and Community Development funds. They don't have a commission overseeing MoCD. So thanks to the work of Budget Justice, now MoCD has to hold at least 2 public meetings about their budget. So in January or February, whether it's a commission that oversees your budget, like the Health Commission, or a public meeting that the department has to hold, you can see and you can participate in these hearings to see what is coming up come the budget, the new budget year that in San Francisco starts on July 1st. During March to May, which is the period we're in right now, the mayor's budget office makes their adjustment. So this is different if you come from a different city or if you're new to San Francisco. We have a very strange budget process. Most cities at this point have either an iterative budget process or a draft budget process. If you look at Seattle, Honolulu, Philadelphia, all of these places, the mayor or the executive branch announce a budget that is then worked on and given feedback on by city departments and by the public. In Honolulu, the first draft budget is released on February 1st, and then the city council holds hearings. The second draft budget is released on April 1st, another set of hearings, and so on and so forth. In San Francisco, we don't have that. We have the mayor releases her draft budget on June 1st. That's it. That's the first time you get a peek into kind of that box after the budget hearings at the commissions and the public hearings. In June, then the Board of Supervisors Budget Committee holds hearings and deliberations. So if you're familiar with the city's budget process, you've probably heard about add-backs, you've probably heard about add-back night, you've probably heard about people being at City Hall, sitting in the hallways for hours and hours, doing maybe not much. And this is kind of the most public-facing part of the budget, because actually the public has a very clear opportunity to influence what the budget looks like, because they have access to elected members, whether those members represent them because they live in their district, or those members represent the nonprofit because the nonprofit operates in that district. You have access and you can go knock on the doors of your elected supervisors and say, hey, this is really important. And so during the month of June, there's a lot of advocacy that happens around the budget. And it's really important to kind of see that this is not the only opportunity you have to comment on the budget or work on the budget. In July, the Board of Supervisors vote on their final budget proposal. And so by July, you wrap up kind of this whole process that starts back in December. So as you imagine, and the focus from the media and from a lot of people is the month of June, but actually this is a process that takes 7 to 8 months to finalize. The other thing that's important is to remember that why are we talking about the mayor and the Board of Supervisors? Because in most systems, I was going to say in the US system, but actually even in other countries, the executive branch has the power to spend, but the legislative branch has the power to allocate. So the Board of Supervisors is the only body that can say how money can be spent, and the mayor is the only person who can spend that money. So in the past, we've had a situation in which the Board of Supervisors have allocated millions of dollars to priorities that the mayor didn't want to spend money on. And so that money has remained unspent. Now, the mayor can't spend that money on their pet project, but they also can choose not to spend money allocated by the Board of Supervisors. So there's always a balance in the budget process, and there's always a balance to address the priorities both of the executive branch and of the legislative branch. If you like a visual person like me, you can see it on this chart, which is included in the mayor's budget book, which kind of shows you what we talked about. Budget instruction, department submit request, budget request, mayor submits general fund department and capital budget, and the budget is enacted, and the mayor usually signs the budget in the early month, in the early part of August. This is kind of the introduction of how the budget works, what is important to remember, and kind of how you can get involved. I'm going to get into advocacy in just a minute, but I'm going to recap basically 3 important things that I think are important to remember when you leave this lunch and learn. One is San Francisco has a huge budget, $14 billion. That is a huge amount of money. And so in your advocacy, in your efforts, never be discouraged by a simple, well, we don't have enough money to do that. Second thing, 14 billion is a big number, but what we're talking about, which is the discretionary portion of that, is 5 billion. Still a shit ton of money and still a lot of opportunities for advocacy. And the third thing is this is a dance between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the public. We all have a role to play in what gets funded, and we all have power and we all have influence, and it is important that we use that power and influence to do the things that we think are important in this process. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about do's and don'ts when advocating for an ad back. I should probably start by saying you might look at me like, what is an ad back? That's a weird word. I've never heard it, which is, it's true. It's a very weird word. You probably have never heard it unless you've been around budget advocacy in San Francisco. But this process that we talked about, where the mayor publishes her budget and the Board of Supervisors then kind of go through it, that process is called the ad back process. And it is literally because programs and priorities are added back into the budget. The mayor presents a budget, it's balanced. If you are a Hamilton fan, you know that Hamilton gave the federal government the authority to issue debt. Unfortunately, Hamilton did not give local and state government the ability to do that. So the budget of the city and county of San Francisco has to be balanced. And so when you want to add, say, $2 million for health programs and nutrition programs into a department, you need to find $2 million in another department to cut. And so you're adding back programs through this process. So weird name, but you'll get very familiar with it very quickly. Okay, so let's start with the positive things. What should you do if you're advocating for yourself, for your community, for your nonprofit? What are the things that you should do and you should remember when you're advocating? And this is advocating with the mayor's budget office. This is advocating with the board of supervisors. This is advocating with your neighbors. This is also advocating in writing. This is advocating in person at a city hall meeting. We're trying to capture all of those. Okay, you're going to look at me and be like, why is this the number one thing? But it is actually the number one thing, because you should ensure that the priority that you're advocating for, the program you're advocating for, is not funded, or not funded at the level that you think is meaningful. This is the number one thing that we see in budget advocacy, where come June 1st, when the mayor releases her budget, everybody scrambles because there's a fear of projects and programs not getting funded. But oftentimes, actually, the answer is those programs were funded. And so the number one thing you should do is educate yourself and get a little bit of information. So if you think that there's a program that is needed in the city, maybe it already exists, and maybe they don't have capacity to expand funding. I think during the pandemic, we saw a lot of efforts around food justice and food security, but some of the organizations that did that work realized that, hey, this is not a scale that is infinite. Like, I can provide 100 meals, but if you're asking me to provide 5,000 meals, I just can't, because I'm literally like packing them myself. And I can't hire staff because maybe my place is not big enough. I want to make sure that that's kind of the number one thing on your radar, because it takes a lot of effort, and there are a lot of programs advocating for funding out there every year. And so making sure that you are there because your advocacy is needed for the program that you care about is important. Otherwise, you can be there and advocate for other programs that you think are meaningful, but at least it's clear to you that maybe your job isn't on the line, maybe that the services that you think are really important to your community aren't on the line. Be precise, right? When you're advocating for the budget, it kind of seems redundant, but like, there's a huge difference if you're advocating for $50,000 in a budget or for $500,000. So always be precise and specific about what you think the thing you want to advocate for is and how much money it's going to cost. Be concise. As you can imagine, I worked at City Hall. I did budget work. I was the aide who worked and heard kind of all the advocacy around budget. And I heard hundreds of, asks and hundreds of requests. And so trying to be concise and understanding that, hey, you might only get 5 minutes with somebody who works at City Hall, who's the supervisor, who is there to listen to you, but also is there to listen to a lot of other people. This is probably, I think, the most impactful of these. When you're advocating for funding from the city, tell a personal story. Tell a story about how this funding impacts yourself, impacts the people you work with, impacts the life of others. Because I think that sometimes in advocacy, we stay very high level, right? We're like, this is we stay very high level, or we really try to work on the angle that this funding is very important and maybe morally the right thing to do, right? Like funding food access and food security is really important. It's a basic function of people to eat and, you know, have a safe place to sleep, etc. But I think that one thing that we don't always do is we don't always tell a personal story. And I think it's important to tell a personal stories for a couple of reasons. One is that people are more easily relate to personal stories. And we can laugh about it, right? You'll open, you know, your local paper. For us in San Francisco, it's the Chronicle, and you read about John, who, you know, loves San Francisco but is leaving to go back to Montana. And, you know, you're like, why do I care about John? I don't do the work that John does. I have nothing in common with John. But people do relate sometimes to personal stories, and I think it's important to tell personal stories. The second one is that I can't tell you how many times I might have forgotten the details of a particular budget ask, like how much money, which department you're advocating for, the money to go to. That's why when you saw me at City Hall, I used to carry a binder around, like a 3-ring binder, like a big one, with all kind of like the details and all the, you know, one-pagers that everybody put together in a binder, so I could be reminded of, oh, okay, well, you know, Laura was telling me she really wants to see funding go to this thing, and I can kind of look up what exactly that was. But you know what I never forget? I never forget the personal story, and it stays with me. And so it's easier for me to recall, okay, you know, Kim was telling me about this, you know, person who benefits from the services that she's advocating for. And that story I remember. I might not remember what organization or department or, you know, what amount, but I do remember the personal story. Highlight the need and uniqueness of what you're advocating for. I think that's also important, right? There are so many programs, and people, the city funds so many things. What is unique about the program you're advocating for? What is unique in terms of the program itself, but also the need, right? In San Francisco, we have the beauty, I think, of many organizations serving very specific communities and doing it incredibly well because they're culturally competent, linguistically competent, you know, they know how to reach those people. And so highlighting the need and the uniqueness of the group or funding that you're advocating for is really important. This is also silly, right? But it is true that you have to know your bottom line. When you're advocating for a program and you're the person who's in charge of advocating for the program, you might, you know, be clear that what you're advocating for ideally should be funded at a $250,000 level. And so you go to the supervisors, you walk around, you do your all your advocacy with the mayor, and it's always 250,000. But then come budget night and during kind of negotiations, you know, members of the board of supervisors come back and say, hey, Jennifer, we can give you 150. And maybe that doesn't make sense for Jennifer because the program is structured in a way that you need 2 staff, you need the ability to do X amount of work. And so maybe that is actually not like something that is helpful. And having the ability to say to the supervisors, you know, if you can't give me 250, like I'd rather wait a year, like apply to more funding externally, show you that this works in another context. Or maybe that's great, right? Like be clear and know, yes, I can do the same program. It might be less meals, it might be less services, but I can do this program as well. So remember the binder story, have a written summary of your ask. It's, if I run into Andy in the hallway when I work at City Hall, and they are like, hey, I really want to, you to fund this program. It's really cool. It does like packaged meals for families in the Bayview. I'm not going to remember that once I come back to my office. So have a written summary of your ask. Ideally, it should be 1 page. It should have 3 key things on it. It should have the amount. It should have the program and kind of what it is that you're asking the funding to go to. And it should have a contact person, because then if I have any questions, I don't have to remember if I was handed this piece of paper from Andy or Lydia. I can just look at the piece of paper and see who it was that handed it to me. The other thing in the do's, as we kind of head towards the end of this training, is do participate in coalitions. I think it's really important because you not only do you get the benefit of understanding kind of the budget, which is complicated, and getting access to people that have maybe more experience than you, but you also understand the bigger picture. You understand that there might be a lot of people advocating for the same thing or a different thing, and you might understand how these dots all connect. And most importantly, you might understand that there will be moments in which like people are going to say, well, I'm sorry, I have to choose between X and Y, and so I have to choose between these 2 people. And we don't want to empower that model in which we're pitted against each other. We don't want to have a situation in which an elected says, well, I'm sorry, I had to choose between what Leah was saying and between what Austin was asking for. The last few things, have a point person, as I said in the written summary, right? A point person, somebody who knows this program, knows this budget ask, who knows the program in and out. And I'm going to say one more thing, a person who's available during the month of June. If you know you're going to be on leave during the month of June, and even though you are the most capable and the smartest and most knowledgeable person in your organization about this program, you can't be the contact person. The contact person needs to be available in June during the budget process at the Board of Supervisors. Don't have 2, don't have 3, just have 1 person. And I know this is maybe counterintuitive, but there's a lot of things that are happening at a very fast pace, and therefore it's important that you kind of have 1 contact and 1 key person. Know your people is the last one. At City Hall, now there's 4 legislative aides per supervisors. There's the mayor's budget directors. There's analysts in the mayor's budget office. There's a lot of people that touch the budget. And it's important for you not to meet them on June 28th when the budget is trying to be finalized. And you're like, hi, sorry, I'm so-and-so, and I'm trying to like let you know about this really important thing that's happening in my community. Like, get to know the people that work on the budget process in each office, meet with them ideally as early as possible. And so know your people and know who can give you information and can be like, hey, honestly, Darren, this is not gonna be easily funded, or maybe it is, and they can be like, hey, don't worry if you don't see kind of your ask on the list. It's gonna be there at the end of the day. Going to go a little bit quicker on the don'ts, because they're actually mirrors of the do's, and they reflect kind of some of the feedback that I gave first. Don't be dishonest, right? At the end of the day, we're all trying to be as clear and transparent as possible. And I know we all have different level and of trauma around money. And so probably would make sense. Certainly sometimes it makes sense when we were kids and we go to our parents and we're like, hey, can I have $10? Because you really hope that you can get one to get some candy, but you shouldn't do that during the budget process. If the program that you want to kind of advocate for needs 250,000, it doesn't need 2 million. And it's not, you're not more likely to get 250,000 if you ask for 2 million. Don't be vague, right? Oh yeah, I have this idea, it's great. It's a program, it helps people. I haven't figured it out yet, but like the city should fund this. Not helpful. Who is it for? Where does it go? How much money? Is this an existing program? Is this a program that needs expanding? Is this a program that, you know, doesn't exist yet? Don't have staff be the only people to advocate for a program. Like a lot of us work in nonprofits, and so it's true, right? It's harder and it's unfair in a way for people that benefit from our programs to have to go to City Hall and tell a story. We're paid to be there 9 to 5 or whatever hours we do. But it is actually incredibly more effective if the people that benefit from the program can come with you. And you can be creative with that. It can be letters, it can be videos, it can be many things. It doesn't need to be like in person at City Hall with you spending 3 hours, but it can be in a way in which their voice is still heard. Again, kind of don't be vague, don't be generic. Like, hey, we need to get people off the street and get them housing. Yeah, we all know that. There's 8,000 people on average sleeping on the streets of San Francisco every night. How are we going to do that? How are you going to do that? How is the funding that you're kind of advocating for going to impact that? Again, going to that dishonesty, right? Don't ask for an amount when you know you need a smaller amount. Like, again, when we were kids, maybe that was a good idea and that was a good strategy, but we're adults now. So be clear and know, kind of like in the dues, right? Know your bottom line. Maybe a program that you are advocating for $100,000, if you get 90,000, it doesn't work because maybe you need a piece of software, maybe, I don't know, right? But like, know your bottom line and ask for the amount that you really actually need. Okay, so the budget process will have a big public comment day. This is a day in which 5 hours of people saying, hey, you should fund this, you should fund that. It's a great event. Budget Justice usually has a great rally. People are excited because kind of we feel like, oh, wow, there's power. Like all these people are demanding all this cool stuff to get funded. But you can't just rely on that day and going to City Hall on that day. You have to know your people, get to know people, have meetings with supervisors ahead of that one day in June. Don't have multiple people be the contact. Again, pick the person who's there, who will be there in June, who knows the most. Don't only talk to the people you like or know at City Hall. I mean, I've worked at City Hall. There's certainly some of my colleagues who I knew from back then, or some people that I like that have come on and worked at City Hall after that. If I only talk to the people I liked at City Hall, A, that wouldn't be a very long list, and B, like I would be doing my community a disservice. Have meetings with supervisors that you don't think agree with you, that you don't think have the same priorities as you. Because at the end of the day, when you're advocating, that's really powerful. I'm going to stop here. I know it was a lot of me talking at you, and it was a lot of content. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. I didn't see any question, but I'll open up for question, and I will drop my email and my phone number in the chat. So if you think about a great question and you're still like finishing your lunch and you're like, I'm going to ask Matthias that question after, please feel free to reach out. As I said, when I started this job and when I started this work around the budget, so many people taught me so many things that allowed me, A, to keep my job, and B, to keep doing this work that I love and I care about. So I I definitely want to give back, and I definitely am here for you. And there's no silly questions. There are no stupid questions. The budget is a huge, complicated thing. And for us to be effective advocates in the budget process, we need knowledge. And so I'm here to answer questions right now for like 7 minutes, but also I'm available after via email, or text is usually easier to reach me. So I'm going to stop sharing, see if there's any questions, and put my contact info in the chat.
Thank you so much, Matthias. It looks like Marianne asked in the chat, what is the best way for folks to get involved with the Budget Justice Coalition?
Yeah, so you should email me, and I'll put you in contact with our admin at the Budget Justice Coalition. His name is Ahmed. He's really awesome. And he'll add you to our distribution list and our Google Drive, and there's a ton of really good information. And we have monthly meetings that allow you to participate and meet other people that are doing budget work in San Francisco.
Great. Let's go to Jennifer and then Delilah.
Hi, thanks, Matthias. This was an awesome presentation. So much great information. I think I have a two-part question. First, there is a big difference between advocacy for mayor's budget and also ad back. What would you recommend is the biggest difference if we actually want to carve out a space in the mayor's budget from what you recommended for ad back? And then also second part, the ad back, when in the past, our organization is pretty small, so we've just advocated to our supervisor because at the end they have the last say. Like, do you recommend that we talk to other supervisors about ad backs? So thanks.
So on the first question, how do you advocate to the mayor? So I think that the number one thing I would say is establish, and this year they have a new process, but establish a contact with the mayor's budget director, and we will send out, when we send out the slide and the recording, the contact information for her. And they have a process this year in which they're asking people to fill out a Google form or some sort of form. So they can also track kind of requests. I think it's a lot more challenging. As I said, kind of like the supervisors, it's easier. You either know them or you can go to City Hall, knock on their door, somebody will usually let you in. The mayor's office, it's a little bit more complicated. But that said, I think it's really important to do that advocacy with the mayor's budget director and with the mayor herself. And I think that in terms of advocating, I think it's a good practice, Jennifer, to like go beyond, as I said, the people you know and the supervisors. Maybe if your organization is small, it's actually more of an education effort rather than kind of like a budgetary advocacy. You're like, hey, we need 20,000 to do this work. You know, that's the level where your supervisor is probably the most effective. But I think it's important because in 5 years or in 5 months, maybe you'll need more money and you'll want to expand. And so at that point, the other supervisors already know kind of what work you do. And you can start with maybe the supervisor whose district is close to where you provide services. And so you're like, hey, if 20% of our of our participants actually come from your district, and you start small and with one other person, or the members of the budget committee, there's 5 of them. Okay, we'll start a little bit larger. Don't go directly to 11 members of the board. That's a lot of work. Yeah.
Awesome. Delilah.
Hello. I was interested in, your pie chart was amazing, but I was wondering, how do reserves fill in for that, and how flexible are reserves? Because there's another, sometimes when we advocate, there's another layer of like, oh, well, that's reserve money, or we need so and so for the reserves. So I just wanted to kind of know how that worked.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the pie chart, the reserves are built in. So part of that $5 billion is reserves. Now, one thing that's like dramatically different from 2008 to today is the amount of money the city has on reserves, which is both a good thing, right? Which in 2008, one of the reasons all these programs were slated for cuts was like 2 bad budget years and we were out of money, and we just didn't know, we didn't have a savings account, right? Like kind of what your parents sometimes tell you about, like saving for like the rainy day. Yeah, that was something the city wasn't doing. And so there's a balance there between saying, okay, we want to actually like do something bold and big, and so we want you to take money out of the reserves, and also realizing like, the 5-year projection says in 5 years, the city will have a $1.5 billion deficit. Now, that's not saying science fiction because, that's a loaded term. It's certainly based on economic data, but, it's also the reality of kind of like what the city has to say about how prudent they want to be. So if they say big number deficit, then they can put more money into a savings account and be justified for it. So I think kind of balancing and knowing, yep, reserves are actually part of that budget, and we should look at that as part of that budget, and we should go after it. Like last year, the city had a budget surplus for the first time in 25 years. The mayor still drew money out of the reserves for her budget. So we can all do that.
Awesome. And I think in our last minute, we have Saida for a rapid fire question before we close out.
Yes. So I just want to get some confirmation. One is add backs. I thought they were all predetermined, but it sounds like you can sneak into some add backs as a list. And then I wanted to just confirm, are you encouraging us to be active with the city advocacy, both in February and in June?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes and yes. And I think that the add back list changes every minute, right? So if you're at City Hall at 6 p.m. and you're like, oh, I'm on the list, I'm good, I can go home and, chill. I mean, unfortunately, things could happen and you wake up the next day and be like, wait, I thought I was on the list and I'm no longer on the list. So yeah, you can sneak in or out of the add back list very quickly.
Wonderful. Well, Matthias was generous enough to put his email and phone number in the chat. So if folks have other questions, that offer is out there. And thank you so much, Matthias, for joining us. This was a really great add-on to our evolving budget conversation. Yeah, so thanks everybody. We're at time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.